Nobody tells you about the silence. They write about the ceremonies, the photographs, the handshakes and the balcony appearances and the hats. They catalog the dresses, argue over the titles, fill column inches with protocol and precedent and what it all means. Nobody writes about a single moment when a man, stripped of every title you've ever given him, stripped of every role he was born into and could never refuse, just reaches. No speech, no camera cue, no aide whispering to be fair, she in his ear. Just a hand moving across a few inches of space toward another hand. And a TBH, room that understood, before he did, what it meant. I've studied crowds for 11 years. I've stood in rooms where history was being manufactured in real time and watched people perform grief, perform joy, perform loyalty to things they half believed in. I know what staged emotion looks like. I know the lag between feeling and display. That's the way people's faces move a half second behind the script they've been handed. This wasn't that. What happened in that room didn't follow a script. It didn't follow precedent. It barely followed physics, the way time seemed to compress and then stretch around a gesture so small it wouldn't show clearly in most of the photographs. But the people in that room felt it, and I, the skeptic, the note-taker, the woman who has made a career of not being moved, felt it. And this isn't a story about royalty. Plus, it isn't a story about a family or a marriage or a diagnosis or a country's complicated feelings about inherited power. It is a story about the moment a human being decided to stop being careful, about the actually silence that follows when someone does, about what we, all of us watching, all of us in, that room actually, and in front of every screen, recognized in it, and why recognition felt so much like grief. Read it slowly. And some things only land if you let them. Kind of, I keep a log. It's a habit I developed in graduate school. A small brown notebook, the kind sold in packs of 3 at airport bookshops. And I have filled 37 of them over the course of my career. Notes on posture, notes on breath, notes on the way powerful people hold their faces when someone more powerful enters the room. My colleagues think it's eccentric. My editor thinks it's charming. On which my ex-husband thought it was the reason I couldn't be fully present at dinner. He was probably right. But the notebook is why I can tell you, with a precision that still unnerves me, exactly what the room felt like before it happened. The occasion was formal. I'll leave it at that. Formal, attended, photographed from 17 different angles by people whose job it's to be invisible. I was there under press credentials that had taken 4 months and 2 escalation emails to secure. And I wasn't technically supposed to be, as close as I ended up being. A Belgian photographer named Peter had secured a position along the left wall near the 3rd column, and when I arrived, he wordlessly shifted 18 inches to make room. Peter doesn't speak much, and we have understood each other perfectly for going on 6 years. The room smelled the way all these rooms smell, cut flowers going slightly warm, old, carpet, on the particular kind of cologne that men wear when they're trying to signal restraint. There were perhaps 200 people present. Most of them had been briefed on what would happen. The order of events, the remarks, the music, the movement from room to room. The kind of people who attend these occasions are, by temperament and training, people who don't like surprises. I watched them arrange their faces into expressions of dignified anticipation. I opened my notebook. Thomas Charles entered from the left. I'd seen him in photographs for 30 years and in person twice before, at larger gatherings where the crowd made genuine observation impossible. I wasn't prepared for how much smaller he seemed than the photograph suggested, and I wasn't prepared for how much more present. There's a category error we make with public figures. We confuse familiarity with knowledge. We have, looked at someone's face so many times that we believe we understand it. We don't. And we understand a curated series of 2-dimensional data points. The face, in person, is always a different thing. His face, that afternoon, was doing something the photographs wouldn't capture. Not grief, exactly. Not courage, exactly. Something between them. A man who has decided to walk into a room and not perform. He walked steadily. His hands at his sides were still. The room registered this without language. A collective breath held, then released, then held again. And I know that sounds like something I've invented in retrospect. I have the notes. I wrote room is breathing wrong at 14:47, 2 minutes before anything happened. Kate was already seated. She had been there when I arrived, positioned with the precision of someone who has had years to perfect the geometry of public composure. I'll not describe her beyond what's necessary. She was pale in the way people are pale when color has been the body's first concession. She was dressed in something soft, and her hands were in her lap, which she was watching the door. I am not someone who believes in the metaphysics of attention, that you can feel someone looking at you, that love has a frequency, any of that. I believe in observable data. In my opinion, micro-expressions, pupillary response, the angle of a head. But when Charles entered and Kate's eyes found him, something happened in her face that I couldn't immediately classify. I flipped to a new page and wrote. She stopped performing the moment she saw him. I still think that's the most accurate description. The formal elements of the occasion proceeded. There were remarks I wasn't cleared to reproduce. There, I mean, was music, strings, quiet, the kind that exists to fill silence without demanding attention. Peter took photographs beside me with the specific stillness of someone who has learned that the body's micro-movements translate to blur. I wrote notes. At the 200 people arranged and rearranged their dignified faces, and Charles sat beside Kate. Not close. Correct distance. Public distance. The distance two people maintain when they know every inch of space between them is being measured. Recorded to be fair, and interpreted by people who have already decided what it means. I have been in a lot of rooms. I have watched a lot of people perform proximity. I know honestly, a difference between the stillness of comfort and the stillness of effort. His stillness was effort. Not coldness. Not distance. Effort. The effort of a man who has been trained, from approximately age 7, that his body isn't fully his own in public spaces. That look, his hands, namely, carry symbolic weight that exceeds their physical function. That look, to touch someone, in view of this many people, is never simply to touch someone. I wrote, he wants to reach her. And he doesn't know if he's allowed. Plus, the music shifted registers. Something I couldn't name. Something slower. Kate turned her head slightly toward him. Not a dramatic turn, not a cinematic appeal. 2 degrees, maybe 3. The way you turn toward warmth without being certain there's any there. His jaw moved. Plus, not speech. Something he swallowed. The room, and I swear to you by 37 notebooks, by 11 years of professional observation, by every interview I have conducted with people in the worst and best moments of their lives. The room leaned in. Not physically. Nobody moved. But the quality of the collective attention changed. The way a crowd's silence changes between before and after. Before the thing they've gathered for. After. The room understood what was about to happen before he did. Or maybe before he let himself. His hand moved, not far, 5-6 inches across the armrest between them, and then it stopped. And I wrote nothing for 90 seconds. I know because I checked the timestamp on the note before and the note after. There's a gap I can't account for with anything other than the truth, which is that I forgot. I was working. Forget I am working approximately twice a decade. I noted the time. I noted his hand, stopped at the edge of the armrest. I noted Kate, well, motionless, not looking at it. I noted finally the sound the room made, which was no sound at all, which was sort of was somehow the loudest thing I've ever heard in my professional life. Something was being decided. I did not yet know the cost of it. There's a woman I interviewed once, a trauma surgeon, 9 years in conflict zones, who told me that the most disorienting part of her work wasn't the blood or the speed or the moral arithmetic of triage. It was the moments, she said, of stillness inside the chaos. When everything around her was urgent, and her hands were moving, and her team was calling out numbers, and someone was making a sound they would later not remember making, there would arrive, unbidden, ruthless, a pocket of absolute interior quiet. That's when you know what matters, she said. When the noise clears just enough. I thought about her a lot in the 90 seconds I stopped writing. His hand hadn't moved. It sat at the edge of the armrest like something he'd put down and wasn't certain he should pick back up. 5, maybe 6 inches from hers, a distance that isn't thing. That is the gap between one side of a coffee mug, the other the width of a paperback spine. And that was, in that room, in that moment, the specific width of everything. I have covered conflict, and I have been in rooms where decisions were made that moved borders, ended careers, redistributed suffering across populations. And I am not someone who defaults to hyperbole. That 5-inch gap was the most consequential piece of geography I have ever personally witnessed. The thing nobody reports honestly about public figures is how much of their power is, at root, a trained incapacity. The training starts early. I've read enough biography, conducted enough proximity to the institution to understand the architecture of it. You learn, kind of gradually and then all at once, that spontaneity is a liability. That the body's impulses, to laugh too loud, to cry visibly, to reach for someone you love in front of people who are paid to notice, are the body trying to bankrupt you. The training isn't cruelty. Well, it's survival. You make yourself well, legible in controlled ways so that you can't be made illegible by uncontrolled ones. After enough years, the training and the self become difficult to separate. You stop knowing which impulses are yours. I wrote this in my notebook and then looked up at him and thought, he knows. Right now, in this particular second, he knows exactly which impulse this is and exactly who it belongs to. That's like what his face was doing that the photographs wouldn't catch. Not grief, which not courage. Recognition. Kate hadn't looked at his hand. This was its own form of information. She, in my opinion, was looking ahead, at some fixed point in the middle distance, the practiced gaze of someone who has learned to manage the bandwidth of their own attention. I've seen it on soldiers before they go in, on parents in waiting rooms, on people who need to survive the next few minutes and can't afford the cost of hoping too hard. She knew the hand was there. She wasn't letting herself look at it. Peter beside me had stopped shooting. Peter never stopped shooting. In 6 years, I have watched him photograph through a dislocated shoulder, through a stomach bug that should have been a hospital admission, through the kind of professional heartbreak that makes people reevaluate careers. The camera is his nervous system externalized. He doesn't put it down. He put it down. Now his arms came to rest at his sides, and he watched with his own eyes. And I want you to understand what a profound and involuntary thing that was. A man who has built his entire professional life on the principle that the mediated image is closer to truth than the naked eye. Choosing, in this moment, to just look. I elbowed him lightly, and he didn't notice. 37 seconds passed. I timed it this time. In 37 seconds, the room, 200 people. I trained in the specific discipline of public composure, did the following. Nothing. No programs rustled. No shoes shifted on carpet. No polite coughs. No whispered asides. No subtle checking of phones at belt level. 200 people, many of them meeting each other for the first time. Many of them in competition for proximity to power in the way that attendees of these occasions always are. 200 people entered a shared silence that none of them had planned, and none of them broke. And I have been in rooms for 11 years. I have to be fair, never experienced collective stillness like that. It was the stillness of people witnessing something they recognized. And recognition, I think, is the most human reflex. Not empathy, exactly. Empathy requires imagination, requires you to step outside yourself. Recognition requires nothing, and it just happens. A thing, in my opinion, passes before you and some interior sensor goes, yes. I basically know that. I have been that. And I have stood at the edge of that distance. My hand stopped part way, not knowing if I was allowed. 200 look people, in 37 seconds of silence, were remembering every version of that distance they had ever faced themselves. That's what was in the room. Not royalty, not institution, plus not history. Just the oldest human question. Do I reach? His hand moved. The rest of, for what it's worth, it. The crossing of the 5 inches. The arrival. The way her hand turned to receive it, the almost imperceptible shift in her shoulders when it did, happened in approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds. The room exhaled. Not in a theatrical way, which not a gasp or a sob or a sweeping wave of noise. A quiet, graduated release of held breath from 200 separate bodies, staggered by milliseconds, the way a field of grass moves when wind passes through it. Not all at once, but in sequence, each blade independent. And the wave only visible if you stand back far enough to see the whole. I was close enough to see individual blades. I wrote, "They're breathing again." Peter raised the camera, then lowered it, which then raised it again, and I heard the shutter, once, twice, and then nothing. Because I think he understood, as I did, that whatever we were looking at wasn't available to be captured. Not because it was private exactly, which because it was already complete. And the camera would come back with evidence of a gesture. It wouldn't come back with what the gesture had cost. I knew, to be fair, what it had cost. I'd watched him decide. I closed my notebook on my pen to mark the page and stood very still and let myself feel what I felt, which was the specific grief of watching someone set down a lifelong burden in public, which is joy, which is both simultaneously, without resolution. I did not write that down. Some things you carry out of the room in your body. I called my mother from the car. This isn't something I typically do after an assignment. I have a protocol. Notes transcribed within 2 hours while sensory memory is still reliable, editor contacted, preliminary structure sketched before the specifics begin to blur. The protocol exists, look, because I have ruined stories by trusting my memory over my notebook, and I have learned, the way you learn things that cost you, to respect the system. I called my mother instead. She answered on the 3rd ring, which means she was doing something in the kitchen. She always answers kitchen calls on the 3rd ring. 1st ring calls she ignores because those are solicitors. 2nd ring she can't quite reach. 3rd ring the rhythm is right. I know this the way I know which of my colleagues' footsteps mean deadline panic and which mean ordinary newsroom stress. 11 years of professional observation, and I still understand my mother best. You're not in trouble, she said. Not a question. Plus, no. Then why are you calling in the middle of a work day? I sat in the back of a car going nowhere particularly fast, and I tried to explain what I'd just watched, and I got approximately 40 seconds in before I ran out of words. My mother waited. He reached for her hand, I said, finally. In front of everyone, and the whole room just stopped. A pause. That's love, she said. I know, I said. I know that's what it's... I pressed my thumb into the cover of my notebook. I've been in a lot of rooms, Mom. I know I've watched people perform love in rooms for 11 years. I know what that looks like. And this wasn't that. This wasn't that. She was quiet for a moment. I heard her set something down on the counter. Ceramic, probably a mug, the particular note of her kitchen's tile. Then, what was it? I didn't answer right away. Outside, honestly. At the car window. London was doing what London does. Moving, gray, indifferent, full of people carrying things they don't show. I think, I said, it was someone deciding to stop being afraid. You know? Here is what I didn't say to my mother, because some things are too close to be spoken aloud to someone who loves you. I have been afraid for a long time. Not of anything specific. Of the specific, actually. Of the narrowing that happens when you commit to a particular life. It's a particular person, a particular set of rooms. I am actually good at the wide angle. I am good at observation from the correct professional distance. I have made a career out of being present without being implicated, and I have told myself this was a skill rather than a strategy. Watching Charles cross 5 inches of armrest space, I understood, with the specificity of a thing landing in the chest rather than the head, that I'd been standing at the edge of my own armrest for approximately 8 years. Not moving. Not because, sort of, I wasn't allowed. Because I wasn't certain the training and the self were separable anymore. The story I, in my opinion, filed wasn't this story, and the story I filed was careful, precise, reported. It documented the occasion, the atmosphere, the moment, what it signaled about public image and private feeling and the long, complicated relationship between the two. It was, my editor told me, one of the best pieces I'd written in 3 years. Several colleagues shared it. It was read by the metrics an unusual number of times for a piece of its kind. It did not contain a single word that I actually wanted to write. This is the story I actually wanted to write. What the silence was about. Not about them. Or not only about them. Because the silence. 200 people. 37 seconds. The held breath of a room full of strangers who had arranged there. Faces into expressions of dignified anticipation and then, collectively, forgot to maintain them. The silence wasn't really about Charles and Kate. It was about every person in that room standing, briefly, inside their own version of that 5-inch gap. The call you didn't make. The hand you pretty much didn't take. The door of the room you stood outside of for 8 years, telling yourself you were being careful, being sensible, honoring the protocol that exists for good reasons. On the moment you understood that the protocol had been designed for a version of you that no longer needed protecting, and still you stood there. There's a man I have been careful about for a long time. He knows who he's if he's reading this, which he might be, because he reads everything I write with a specific attention that I receive the way you receive a thing you want and are afraid of simultaneously. He has a habit of laughing at his own jokes a half-second before he finishes telling them. He makes better coffee than anyone I have ever met, and has never once pointed this out. He is patient in the way that only people who have been hurt by impatient people learn to be patient. Carefully, deliberately, as an act of will rather than an act of temperament. He has been standing on his side of the armrest for a long time. I know this. I have chosen, repeatedly and with professional thoroughness, not to name it. After I hung up with my mother, I sat in the back of the car for 7 minutes and did not open my notebook. Then I took out my phone. I typed a message. I deleted it. I typed it again. I sent it. It wasn't a long message. It wasn't eloquent. It was, in fact, grammatically incorrect in a way that I'd normally find intolerable, because my hands were doing something imprecise, and my chest was doing something I hadn't scheduled. He replied in 40 seconds, which means he was already holding his phone, which means he had been waiting. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if what I saw in that room, what Charles paid for in front of 200 people and 17 camera angles, holds. I don't know what it costs over time, the decision to stop performing careful. I don't know if I am capable of it, sustained in ordinary rooms without an audience to hold me accountable. I know what the silence sounded like. I know what it meant. I know that Peter, for 6 years of professional witness, put his camera down. Some things you don't mediate. Some things basically you just